Before I introduce our speakers, I want to briefly set the frame for today's discussion. Over the past week, the diplomatic track around Iran has sharpened considerably. Abbas Araghchi's meeting with Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg made clear that Tehran is not approaching negotiations as a simple de-escalation track. Iranian coverage has presented the talks as evidence that Iran is consulting strategically, not negotiating from weakness. Russian coverage, meanwhile, has positioned Moscow as a necessary actor in any settlement architecture. What is especially important is the sequencing Iran appears to be advancing. First, an end to the war and guarantees that fighting will not resume against Iran or Lebanon. Second, arrangements around the Strait of Hormuz, and only after that, a return to the nuclear file. That sequence is important because it tells us something about how Iran and the IRGC are trying to define the battlefield. The nuclear issue is no longer being treated as the sole center of gravity. Maritime pressure, Lebanon, regional actors, and the question of who gets to mediate are all being pulled into the same diplomatic architecture. And for Yemen, particularly for the Red Sea, this raises important questions. The Houthis are not in the diplomatic foreground in the same way Iran is, but their role sits inside this wider regional environment. Their actions, their messaging, and their relationship to Iran's regional posture matters for how we understand risk beyond one theater. So today's discussion will focus on Iran's current trajectory, how its internal and external dynamics are shaping the region, and what risks policymaker may be underestimating. We're joined today by two distinguished speakers. I'll start with Sarah Bazubandai. Sarah, it's lovely to have you with us. Sarah is a visiting scholar at Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. She was previously a Marie Curie Fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, a senior lecturer in international political economy at Regent's University in London. Her work focuses on Iranian politics, political economy, and the internal dynamic of the Islamic Republic, and how these shape its regional behavior. And Professor Thomas Journeau. Thomas is a professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. His research focuses on Iran, Yemen, and the role of intelligence in national security and foreign policy making. Before entering academia, he spent over a decade with Canada's Department of National Defense as a policy analyst covering the Middle East. He also is an associate fellow at Chatham House and a non-resident fellow with the Sana'a Center for Strategic Study. Thomas, it's great to have you with us. So I will invite both of you to give us brief opening remarks, and then we should move on to the discussion. We'll start with Dr. Thomas.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the offer to be with you today. So what I thought I would do for opening remarks, building on Fatima's very good introduction, I will just say a few words on at a high level of how the war of the past 2 months have changed regional geopolitics. And then I think in the Q&A after that, we can zoom in on some of the more specific aspects, including some of the more specific aspects of what does the war imply for the Houthis' role in the region and for Iran-Houthi relations more specifically. But trying to stay at a high level, just to begin in terms of big picture regional geopolitics, if we take a few steps back to before 2023, until October 23, until the Hamas attack on Israel that launched the multiple rounds of war that we are still going through now, there was a very fragile balance of terror in the region, with on the one side the US and Israel, and on the other side Iran. And the two sides would prefer to avoid attacking each other directly. They would confront each other indirectly in Lebanon, in Iraq, in other parts of the region. But there was a perception, and the word perception is important here. There was a perception that it would be irrational to go to a direct war between the two sides because the other side would be able to inflict enough pain on the other that it would make it not worth it. On the American and Israeli side, the perception was that Iran would retaliate through the axis of resistance, through Hamas, through Hezbollah, through other groups in the region, and that their ability to hit Israel in particular, but American interests in the region as well, would inflict enough pain that the US and Israel preferred to avoid direct war with Iran. And on the Iranian side, the perception was, well, the US and Iran are militarily much more powerful, at least in conventional terms, and therefore that would have made an all-out war from the Iranian perspective also irrational. This was a fragile balance, and of course they would confront each other indirectly quite a lot, but there was a perception that it was better not to go to direct war. And indeed, until 2023, we did not see Israel and Iran hitting each other directly. Indirectly, yes, but not directly. October 2023 really changed that. It led to a change in the calculus on the Israeli side. Remember, that balance of terror was the product of perceptions of each side making the calculus that they would prefer not to have a direct war. But because of the shock of the Hamas attack on the Israeli psyche, on the strategic culture inside Israel, there was gradually throughout 2024 a rejection of the notion of that balance of terror, which in practice had as an outcome coexistence between Israel and Hezbollah, Israel and Hamas, and ultimately Israel and Iran. So as 2024 evolved, and then even more so 25, we saw Israel, with American support, steadily dismiss this notion of coexistence and choose total defeat as an objective. Not to say that it was achieved, but as an objective towards Hamas, towards Hezbollah, and eventually towards Iran. Israel did not achieve that total defeat of the other side, but it did achieve a significant degree of success. Varying, but significant. Hamas today is much weaker than it was before. Hezbollah is somewhat weaker than it was before. And 3 times in 2024, April and October, and then a third time in June 2025, we saw Israel and Iran actually hit each other directly for the first time, which had not happened before because they would exercise a degree of restraint on each side. What is really important is that in these 3 instances of direct confrontation, April, October 24, July 25, Israel, and then Israel and the US in June 25, were able to inflict significant damage on Iran. And the notion of a balance between the two sides really was lost at that point, in the sense that we saw the balance of pain, if you want to frame it that way, being very imbalanced, in the sense that Israel and the US were able to inflict significantly more pain on Iran than Iran was able to inflict on Israel. We saw in 24 and 25, Iran sent missiles and drones on Israel, for example, with something less than 10%, probably even less than 5%, actually hitting targets inside Israel and causing minimal damage. Whereas Israel was not only significantly weakening Hamas, somewhat weakening Hezbollah, but also hitting Iran very hard. And we saw in June 25, for example, Israel achieving not complete aerial supremacy over Iran, but significant control of Iranian airspace, and therefore the ability to hit almost at will targets inside Iran. Military targets, but also economic, energy targets, and a range of others. So as 2025 came to an end, the notion of a balance of terror that had characterized the region before 2023 was pretty much shattered, or at least severely damaged. And then, making that even worse from Iran's perspective, the major protests that we saw in December 25 and then early January 26, they were repressed with the use of tremendous violence by the Islamic Republic, thousands, if not tens of thousands of dead. That further built the impression of a much weaker Islamic Republic. So that's where we were as of early 2026. But then we saw another shift, and I'll finish on this in about 1 minute. With the war of February 2026, started on the 28th. Technically, that war is now not really over, even if there's a partial ceasefire. That war has basically had as a result the reestablishment of a balance of terror between the US and Israel on one side and Iran on the other side, even if it's a different balance of terror. In the past, before 2023, the perception was that the balance of terror on the Iranian side was the product of, in large part, the axis of resistance. As a means of deterrence, the axis of resistance failed. It was not able to convince Israel not to attack Iran, and it has been weakened. If Iran has been able to reestablish a deterrence and a balance of terror with Israel and the US, it is primarily through its ability to shut down the Strait of Hormuz and therefore inflict significant pain, not so much to Israel, which is an important part here, but to the US and the global economy as a whole. Secondly, Iran was able to reestablish deterrence distant second, but nonetheless second, by its strikes on Arab states of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, UAE in particular, Qatar, which caused significant damage. And then third, in theory, Iran's ability to impose the return of a balance of terror is, and we'll get to this in the Q&A, through the Houthis. No, the Houthis did not shut down the Bab al-Mandab during the war of 2026, but we all know they could. In theory, physically, they have the capability to do it. So we saw the economic pain from the war of the last 2 months. Just imagine how compounded that would have been had the Houthis also closed trafficking in the Red Sea. They did not do it. We'll get into the Q&A more into detail at that level. But just as a means of setting the stage of how geopolitics in the region have shifted, I thought I would begin by framing it that way. Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. That was a really great overview of the situation and a useful way to set the regional picture, especially the shift from the fragile balance of deterrence to much more exposed and uncertain environment. And what we see currently, like in the shutdown of Hormuz, is maybe kind of what the Houthis did in the Red Sea, last year was a microcosm of what's happening. So it's obvious that we did not learn from that lesson, and we went into this without any kind of consideration to what we have done. But if there's any pattern to maybe induce, is that it took 2 months for the US to say, this, or 2 or 3 months for everything to get contained, because of the global pushback. And I think maybe we may not be in a very different situation. But Sarah, let me turn to you now. Thomas laid out how the regional balance has changed from the outside. I would like to ask you to take us maybe inside Iran. How should policymakers understand the current moment within the Islamic Republic? Are we looking at a system under genuine strain, or one that's adapting to pressure and organizing around it?
Thank you very much, Fatma, for organizing this. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to share my thoughts. Um, you said something very striking, that is, we didn't learn from the lesson, and I assume we is, generally the international community, but the Western powers, from the lessons of the experience in the Red Sea and the crisis that we had there. But I can assure you that the Islamic Republic has learned a lot from that experience, and they are using that in the best possible way. What I see as a result of this crisis is, obviously, for understandable reasons, a weakened, a weaker, angrier, and more determined establishment in Tehran. Also, at the same time, I see a great deal of consistency. You mentioned at the beginning of your opening remarks the way that the negotiation team is handling, for example, the nuclear file. I see a great deal of consistency in that. At the time when Mohammad Javad Zarif was in charge of negotiation with John Kerry in Vienna, the Iranian side had specifically and very clearly sort of ring-fenced the question of nuclear file away from every other pain and grievance that the Americans and the global community and the Western powers had. Regional, we'll get to that later. We need to build some trust. Proxies, it's the binary of battlefield versus diplomacy. Qasem Soleimani at the time was in charge. He's no longer with us. Zarif made it very clear that there is this binary. The decisions about the region is made elsewhere. Khamenei was still with us. It was a useful figure to blame everything on him. So, that it was very much the case that Zarif and negotiation team of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had one single priority, one single mandate, and that was the nuclear file and the nuclear project. They did not want to talk about anything else. And in a sense, what I see now, again with Arakchi and his team, is that they created very successfully a dual track of this crisis. One is no longer about regime behavior, the rhetoric that Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump started at the beginning of this episode. Help is on the way. We want to liberate Iranian people. We want a regime change in a very subtle way. We want to change Iran's behavior. All of that has gone now out of the window. Masterfully, Iranians managed to internationalize, not only regionalize, but internationalize this crisis that is now just about the economy, and it's about Strait of Hormuz. Nuclear file, we will get to that at a later stage, as and when we are ready to speak about it. This is the approach that the Iranians are taking. And this has been, the writing has been on the wall, in my opinion. It is not shocking and surprising, at least for me as a person who has been studying the country for the good part of my career, simply because like I said, I see a great deal of consistency. I believed the entire time that I studied Iran, since the time of the so-called reform era in Iran back in the 90s until today, that there is a great deal of consistency. You have to take them on the face value of what they say. When they talk about resistance, they talk about resistance in the ultimate way of demonstrating resistance at every level. I have looked at the discourse, I've looked at their strategy, and I believe that genuinely one of the biggest lessons learned that biggest lesson that the international community, especially Western powers, should have learned from dealing with Iran since the Islamic Revolution is to take them seriously at face value of what they say. They really genuinely, I mean, there is a saying that we say that certain countries they don't mean what they say, they don't say what they mean, but the Iranians genuinely mean what they say, and we should have taken them seriously. The Western powers, the Western and the global community should have taken them seriously, and we now see that manifesting before our eyes. That there was this understanding in the Western policy circles that rhetoric is rhetoric, ideology is ideology. People say things for the masses, they say for manipulating the public, for mobilizing youth and yada yada, but ultimately they're rational players, and you can deal with them. But I think it is the perfect moment to sit down and reflect on that major assumption about Iran, because they really mean what they say, and they are built. They built a system around their vision. The world looks differently when you sit in Tehran through the eyes of the Islamic Republic, and we fail to understand the world through their lens. And that is why, for example, at the beginning of this crisis, or even in June last year, the assumption was that when certain leaders are eradicated, or even go back to assassination of Qasem Soleimani, if Soleimani is eradicated, if this person X, Y, Z, Khamenei himself, are no longer with us, the regime will capitulate, the regime will change. We will find a Delcy Rodriguez in Tehran, but guess what? At the best case, we found the Robert Mugabe in Tehran, So there is a genuine misunderstanding about how the system works, what is the vision and understanding of that system. And the Iranians have used that to their best, utilizing it in the best way to their own interest. And they have managed to really change the dynamics of this whole crisis. Of course, the objectives of this crisis were always blurry, but now it's completely different dynamics, and the objectives are even blurry, and they're far away from the blurry starting point than they are today. And I'd like to just end my 2 cents on the consequences of this episode for the Iranian people. Once an Iranian, always an Iranian. I can't possibly stop thinking about the pain and the grievance that my fellow citizens are going through, the Iranians are going through. Iran has had major economic issues. Inflation was high. There was sanctions, years of accumulated sanctions. There were years of mismanagement, corruption, fraudulent activities, loss of public assets, you name it. Every possible economic challenge that you can imagine Iran was struggling with. And now on top of that, the Iranians are facing with a regime that is less interested in protecting their welfare and their livelihood because they have other priorities, and that is to maintain their own resistance, and it's to maintain their own stability. And of course, the economic pressure of the war. The internet shutdown has caused a lot of damage to the economy. The blockade is going to further accumulate pressure. There is a tightening of the banking activities across the GCC, handling payments and trade and so on for the Iranian government. Now that is being tighter, and the ability of the government, above all, to generate hydrocarbon revenues is really weakened. So 90 plus million Iranians. I don't know how many percentage of them are sympathizing with the government. I'm not even going to get into that dangerous conversation of coming up with an estimated number. But let's say there is a proportion of them that is not sympathizing with the government. They don't approve of the government's vision and the way that they see the world and the way that they want to interact the world and the role that they want to define for themselves in the global community. And they feel they're being kept hostage, they're deprived, generations after generations being deprived from future, from hope, from livelihood. And I think I keep saying this from the beginning of the crisis. This war might not have any winners ultimately, but it has definitely one single loser, and that is the Iranian people.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. That's probably a depressing and realistic picture, unfortunately. We've learned, again, like a very difficult lesson in Yemen, where the same has happened. Ultimately, negotiations happen between the people who have the power, and it leaves the majority of the people disenfranchised from that decision-making process. And I cannot see, any kind of political settlement in Iran that could, bring the opposition any kind of relief. So that has constantly been the concern, and looking at the Iranian file, is just that it might leave people more exposed. But also, the one thing I wanted to sort of like follow up on is like the distinction you're drawing between continuity and adaptation is really important for policymakers. The idea that Iran is not, or the IRGC is not necessarily changing its strategy, but refining how it structures the negotiation and the narrative around it, because that's constantly a trap. So in that case, wanted to ask you, what does this mean for policymakers who are trying to engage the IRGC right now? Are they negotiating on the same terms that they think they are, or on terms that have already been redefined?
Thank you. Yes. First of all, every time I have conversations with colleagues who work on Yemen or from Yemen, or both, in often cases, the similarities are so striking. And I don't know if they learn from each other's experience. I don't know, God created them so similar. I have no idea. But there's definitely a lot of similarities and a lot of shared approaches towards the same issues in different contexts. Regarding the role of the IRGC, now every self-appointed Iran analyst claims that Iran is becoming more radicalized, IRGC is becoming stronger, IRGC is more involved in decision making. But my answer always to that is that tell me when it wasn't the case in Iran. back in 2010s, when Ahmadinejad, towards the end of Ahmadinejad's presidency, we witnessed the domestic rise of the IRGC power in 2009, post-election crisis. We saw it in oil smuggling. We saw it in capturing of all the beneficial economic activities, basically, in Iran were captured and managed by IRGC directly or indirectly. All the way fast forward to the time of President Rouhani, when hopes were high, we all thought this is the moment, this is the window of opportunity, Iran is going to normalize. But then, right after that deal was reached, the very person, Mohammad Javad Zarif, who was in charge of reaching that deal, came on camera, on the record, and said that there was always a binary of battlefield and diplomacy, and I had to make compromises in diplomacy in order to advance battlefield objectives. So it is, in my opinion, I'm sorry to disappoint everybody, but it is business as usual. It has always been the case. It would not change with killing of Khamenei or Qasem Soleimani or whatnot, because this is how this is the system, that the relationship that works. This has worked for all of them for a very long time. People in uniform, men in uniform in the IRGC cannot function without a diplomacy track, because that is what gives them legitimacy. That is what gives them the language to, have interactions and exchanges with the world. And those in suit with Mont Blanc cufflinks, who are fluent in English, and they can go on international TV discussions, and they can disseminate the regime's objectives and points. They cannot exist without the support of the men in uniform and those armed men. So I don't see a difference between Iran yesterday, on 27th of February versus Iran 28th of February. And the approach is the same. And I do believe that they have come to conclusion, understandably so, that all of that preparation for so-called resistance, concept of resistance of the Islamic Republic, have paid really well. The military technology, the proxies, yes, some of them have now been weakened, but none of them has completely been eradicated. They can revitalize them. They can, I'm not saying it's a correct assumption or not, but I'm saying that from their perspective, if you sit in Tehran, this is how you see the world. Everything has paid back. We are in a very, very comfortable position. We might be in economic pain, but so is the rest of the world. Hey ho. And ultimately, we are able to resist what the rest of the world cannot resist. We are able to keep our citizens quiet and deprived from everything, but the American dream cannot be killed. The European citizens cannot lose their summer holiday because of lack of jet fuel. So it is ultimately, the working assumption is that they have the upper hand. They are not willing to make any compromise, and if required, they're happy to escalate, but they're probably not going to be the first to escalate. And they're sitting in a very comfortable position. They're waiting for the other party to get bored and walk away.
Do you think the blockade that's currently imposed is something that can shift the calculus of the regime? Because ultimately, I mean, you had your article come out yesterday in AJSI on the economy, and the economy is suffering, obviously. But do you think the blockade is an effective mechanism that could pretty much get the regime to negotiate?
Did it work in the case of Bashar al-Assad? Did it work in the case of Putin? Did it work in the case of North Korea? So, nowadays we have a global system that US dollar is no longer the ultimate currency that everybody has to trade with, because there are back channels and there are possible, bartering mechanisms and so on and so forth. Iran has, at least not Iran as a country, the Islamic Republic has made strong network of contacts and partners across the world that they could cooperate with the neighboring countries. There is a reason, there is a logic that Iran really meddled in politics in Iraq for 20 years, because Iraq provides Iran with a very good channel of transportation of goods and smuggling products and you name it, and mixing Iranian crude with Iraqi crude and selling it in the international government market. They sort of have been building a similar relationship with Russia post Ukrainian war, simply because the Russians have also needed some form of similar relation. They need to learn from the experience of Iranians. Now you could use some of the Iranian banking cards in Russia to pull out cash. So yes, the situation is very difficult. Yes, the government is very much, its ability to generate revenue is very much under attack. But honestly, I don't keep my hopes up that they are going to run out of cash tomorrow morning. They will fight back, and they will push back, and they will resist in the literal sense for as long as possible. And of course, let's not forget that there are a significantly powerful economies that are willing to go out of their way to support them, to keep them alive. So again, like I said, the hardest pressure is that the most depressing conditions are ahead of Iranian citizens. But the government, in my opinion, will still find solutions.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I'm gonna move to Thomas. I am curious about your views on the blockade. We've seen a scenario just like it, like, a decade ago in Yemen, almost a decade ago. But also, maybe before I ask that question, I wanted to ask you about the Gulf states and their relationship with Iran. How do you think they're gonna, how do you see the Gulf states recalibrating their approach to Iran in this environment? Especially, the divergence between Saudi Arabia and UAE, even Qatar and Oman have a different relationship with Iran than the rest. Iran is asking for, payment from the Gulf states as well, for reconstruction, in a war that, they're impacted in, and also a war that they did not initiate. So, wanted to just understand the broader implication for coordination and also including energy policy.
Thank you. The Gulf states, as has often been the case, even if the circumstances are completely different, they're caught in the middle. They're stuck in the middle, and there are the collateral damage, in a way, of the war between the US and Iran. It is a war that they did not choose. It is a war on which they had very little influence in terms of the decision to launch it and its conduct. And it is a war on which the only thing they can do for now is to manage the consequences, and especially more specifically try to limit the damage of that war. And here, limit the damage, I think, is the right expression, in the sense that there will be long-term damage to the Gulf states, and that is inevitable. They will suffer losses from this war, and these losses will continue beyond the short term. And all they can do now is to try to limit these losses to as little as possible. There is physical damage. In some cases, that will be repaired in the short term. In other cases, thinking in particular about the liquefied natural gas facility in Qatar, the damage to that, I've seen different numbers, but maybe something like 50 to 20% of production at Ras Laffan, that will go beyond the short term in terms of repairing that. But even beyond that, it's the long-term potential damage to their brand, especially the UAE, Qatar, and increasingly in its own way, Saudi Arabia, with all the quite dynamic economic reforms, socioeconomic reforms there in the last few years. These reforms, that brand is premised on the image of stability, on an image of come and do business with us, whether it's white collar business, shipping, and so on, and the environment will be stable. And the war has damaged that. What will be the long-term impact? at this point, we don't know. I think there's an optimistic scenario where things will stabilize, the damage will be minimal, people will forget, business will resume. I don't think that's necessarily naive, but that's the ideal scenario that is perhaps at a low probability as opposed to being impossible. The catastrophic scenario is, a prolonged muddling along of the war between the US and Iran. And right now, between the US and Iran, we are in a no war, no peace scenario. The war has stopped in the sense that the shooting has stopped, but there are no serious peace talks. We can't assume that that is only for the short term. There is a scenario where this no war, no peace scenario goes on for quite a while, including perhaps months or even beyond that, and that a new status quo, difficult status quo emerges. I think Sarah mentioned that the main losers of that in that scenario is the Iranian people. That's absolutely true. Another loser of that scenario is the Gulf states because of the damage that that will do to their brand and therefore to their ability to do business. And by business, I mean trade, but I also mean investment. And even beyond that, increasingly, Doha, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Riyadh were centers of diplomatic power, not just economic and financial power. So that will be damaged as well. So what does that mean? Well, the Gulf states may have a degree of anger towards the US for having launched the war, not consulted them much, not allowed them to provide much influence on the conduct of the war, on the aftermath of the war. But they all realized to varying degrees and understanding that in all six cases of the Gulf states, the Arab states of the Gulf, the context is a bit different in each case, but they have no choice but to remain close to the US, especially in the no war, no peace scenario that is prolonged. There is no alternative to the US as the guarantor of their security, as resentful to some degree as they may be, because Iran remains, because the Islamic Republic is not going anywhere. It has not fallen, and I don't expect that it will fall, and putting aside any hopes that more staying on the prediction side that it will go anywhere. So they will have no choice but to remain close to the US for the foreseeable future. They will need to replenish their air defenses, counter drone, counter missile capabilities that, as an aside, performed quite well. I think I was, if anything, surprised at how well they did in terms of defending against Iranian missiles and drones, especially if you compare how badly the UAE and Saudi Arabia did against Houthi missiles and drones just a few years ago. So they will need to replenish that, not only in terms of equipment, but also in terms of intelligence, coordination, information sharing, and so on. I do expect that they will intensify their already ongoing efforts to diversify relations beyond the US with European countries. We saw France, the UK, and Italy in particular play limited but non-negligible roles in terms of helping them in their defense during the war. I expect that that will continue towards Asia as well. We have seen the UAE and South Korea, which is super interesting, deepen cooperation on defense issues. South Korea has one of the most dynamic defense industries in the world right now, and it is banking on these opportunities in the Gulf. So I expect that to continue, but always underneath the American umbrella, which will not go away. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Thomas. That was a very sharp intervention as well, and your point about diversification is really interesting, especially the idea that the Gulf states are expanding their partnership without fundamentally shifting their core security dependence. So I didn't think about it that way, especially that many members in the Gulf were caught off guard. One thing comes to mind is that Qatar has joint gas field with Iran, and I think that's, very important. So its posture to Iran cannot remain rigid. Oman has also its own interest, and I think the way these two countries behave is a bit of a departure than the rest of the Gulf. And now UAE has exited from OPEC plus, and that opens another, also like a set of scenarios as well. But I wanted to ask, just if that kind of diversification you've mentioned, can it meaningfully change the strategic position, or is it just about managing risk and constraint? Number two is, do you see perhaps even like more of an alignment with the IRGC in order to um, stop any kind of attacks on the Gulf, like an increasing posture towards normalization with the IRGC rather than Israel, for example?
Thank you. As an aside, and this goes slightly away from the topic, but that notion of remaining under the US security umbrella, but diversifying relations underneath that, that I think characterizes Gulf efforts now, it was the case before the war. It's going to be the case after the war, even if the details change. I say that as a Canadian, which is our reality. And, you know, the comparison between Canada and the UAE or Qatar is extremely flawed. I mean, it's completely different circumstances, but we are extraordinarily dependent on the US, on the trade and the security side. We realize under Trump now that that is a major vulnerability. And so we are actively trying to diversify. And that's why our prime minister is traveling like crazy. He's going to be in Armenia over the weekend for an EU summit to deepen relations with the EU. We are trying to diversify, but we will never be able to completely remove ourselves from the American umbrella. In our case, because of geography. In the case of the Gulf states, also geography, but a different kind of geography. It's the reality that they're neighbors with Iran, which brings me to your specific question. Are they going to try to redefine, I would say, a kind of modus vivendi with the reconfigured Iranian regime post-war, whatever precise shape it takes? I think so, but we already saw that before the war. In the past 3 to 4 years, again, to varying degrees, and you pointed out some of the differences between the Gulf states, and you're absolutely correct. Their circumstances are all unique in some ways, but for reasons of time, if I'm trying to generalize to all six of them, um, they already were achieving some kind of coexistence with with Iran. Look at Saudi Arabia since about 2022-23. There was a clear effort, and I think it was initiated by Saudi Arabia. It needed a bit of convincing, but Iran saw an interest. It was not reconciliation. It was not harmony. It was not friendship. It was not an alliance. Far from it. They were still rivals. They were still competitors. But there was an agreement on both sides that we have a common interest, even if for different reasons, in better managing our mutual tension. That worked until the war. It worked in a very cold and limited way. Tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia were cooler. You know, they were better managed in the past 2 to 3 years. I would expect that to continue. Qatar has traditionally taken that logic a lot further, including, as you said, because of that shared gas field, and I think a few other reasons as well. Oman has also taken that that rationale even farther because of its own vulnerabilities and historical legacies and so on. So I expect that logic to continue once the dust settles after the war. Not quite right now. That logic will be hampered by one key element, which is the very bitter legacy of the war in the UAE in particular, but in others as well. The memory of thousands or hundreds in other cases of Iranian missiles and drones landing on their heads will remain, but geography will always matter. That's true for us in Canada in our own way, and that's true in the Gulf in the sense that they are neighbors. They are a few dozen kilometers across the Gulf from Iran in a way that Israel is not 2,000 kilometers away, and obviously the US even less so. So you use the expression managing risk in your question. I think that will be exactly it. It will be a matter of managing the reality that the relation of all six Gulf states with Iran will remain fundamentally hostile, but the essential need to manage the risks of that hostility, I think, will gradually reemerge as the dust settles after the war.
Again, like, thank you again. That's the distinction again is very helpful and the way that you've explained it, the coexistence. I think, you know, in a sense, we're seeing just a region emerging that is going to be adapting to new environment that just have not been there before and a new calculus that was not has not really entered their psyche. So I think everyone is still sort of adapting at the moment. Maybe I'll ask a question for both of you as we are you know, dealing with this new environment. Um, uh, Perhaps, you know, what do you think that is being still underestimated by um, international policymakers in understanding the current trajectory and where things are headed? Maybe I'll start with Sarah, um, and then we'll go
Sure.
to Thomas.
Yes, thank you very much. And I couldn't agree more with Thomas about the changes that this whole episode is going to bring to the region. For sure, it was very interesting indirect exchange between Reem Al-Hashmi from the United Arab Emirates, who said it on camera on an interview, that Iran is attacking us because we are everything that they are not. And it was picked up by local media, and one of the propagandists, major chief propagandists in Tehran, replied to that statement on national state TV in Iran, and said, "But we still managed to defend ourselves, and you can't even do that." So the vulnerability that the Iranian government wanted to expose to the Gulf countries has been exposed, and I expect them to diversify more, them to try to also find other parallel tracks to coexist with Iran. If anything, at the moment, the expediency requires to maintain a degree of understanding, or establish a degree of understanding for future coexistence, because a lot of the visions that the Gulf countries had really depends on that branding, that this island of excellence or islands of excellence within a very volatile region. That was the message, that was the image, that was the prestige that they have established. And now it's been under attack by the Iranian activities. So I would expect each and every one of them in their own way to seek finding solutions. Some of these countries, the UAE, for example, they have a different claim to agility in politics, let's put it this way, right? So they perceive agility in a political sense in a different manner than perhaps people in Riyadh would see that. For them, agility in politics doesn't mean anything. It's all about longer term prospect, and it's all about longer term stability. So each and every one of the capitals across the GCC speak their own political language, but ultimately size matters. Iran has 1,200 coastlines in the north of the Gulf, and they can't deny that. And that is the reality of the geography. And I think at the moment, just going back to your question after a very long-winded sort of detour to make some of my points about the GCC, and I apologize for that. I think what we or the international community is getting wrong about this episode is that we always tend to understand, especially in the Western world, tend to understand our adversaries the same way as we understand our allies. We assume that the working assumptions, the working, the functions, the roles within every political system, desire, priorities are shared across the world, because ultimately we all are human beings and we are expected to have similar enough similarities to be able to work on them. But I think more and more, especially in that part of the world, in across the Middle East, North Africa, we're getting to conclude that we need to understand our adversaries from their own perspective. You need to sit in Tehran to be able to understand how to deal with Tehran. You need to sit in Riyadh to be able to understand how to deal with Riyadh. And so long as we fail doing that, and we want to work on a sort of an international standard of understanding and doing business, I think that we are going to fail to achieve any meaningful, long-lasting result.
And Thomas, more or less the same question, although I think both of you are essentially saying, the same thing about the change in the balance of power, deterrence that Iran was able to achieve. And I'm wondering, are we looking pretty much at a region where deterrence is just broken down, or where it has just simply become more asymmetric and less predictable? Because if no particular actor can achieve full deterrence, are we looking at a prolonged conflict in the situation? Um, it's so either this question or the question that I asked before on, kind of like what policymakers are also underestimating, because I think like the current vulnerability that we're seeing at the moment is just leaving open questions. And from experience on how non-state actors negotiate, the bar often keeps shifting. We saw that before in multiple negotiations. And again, like I see the way that we, kind of embarked with negotiations with the Houthis sort of like is going to be similar, or maybe even like the same textbook playbook that we are using with the IRGC. So do you think it's gonna, kind of become a very slow conflict in which, an informal IRGC system that's kind of like half broken and half alive is going to be playing here? Is that something that Israel going to tolerate? And maybe again, like I'm diverting a little bit. But yes, I'd love to hear your points of view.
Uh, I think as the dust settles on the current situation, and as basically we are seeing a new type of status quo evolving in the Gulf between the U.S. and Iran, in the region as a whole between Iran and Israel. War. Conflict, whatever you want to call it, has been going on for decades. So basically, what we're seeing now is a rearrangement of the deck chairs in terms of not only the balance of power in material terms between the multiple sides, but also the balance of perceptions. How do each side perceive the other and perceives its own opportunities and challenges? So yes, the balance of power, the balance of terror, the balance of perceptions is shifting, but it's not fundamentally new in this sense. As Sarah said, and as I said, we were already in a very conflictual situation. What I think, and I'll build up a bit on what I said, I think, for the previous or two questions ago. Right now, we are in a no war, no peace situation. And no peace, I should specify, no war, no peace negotiation, to be more precise. No war in the sense that the shooting has stopped, that we saw for about 7 weeks just recently. But there are not even serious peace talks now, and peace talks is not even the good term. I mean, negotiations between the US and Iran, we shouldn't call them peace talks because there's no serious prospect of the US and Iran achieving anything that would resemble peace for the foreseeable future. It's negotiations that could lead to some form of stabilization of relations, whether with regards to Hormuz, with regards to the nuclear program, or with regards to perhaps a few other regional issues. But it's not going to be all peace, right? Whatever happens. I think what we need to prepare ourselves for, and going back to your questions on risks to policymakers, is to understand, we need to ask ourselves, what is this new equilibrium going to look like? Is it going to be more fragile, more volatile? I think so. I think there's a new form of deterrence that is being established. So I don't think deterrence has collapsed. It's just a new form of deterrence. In the past, Iranian deterrence was premised on the axis of resistance. You attack us, Hamas and Hezbollah will retaliate, and they will inflict so much pain that it would be too irrational for you to attack, therefore you should not attack. That has failed. Now Iranian deterrence, I think, will broadly be premised on the threat to the Strait of Hormuz. That is a threat that we always knew in theory. As you said in the bio, I worked with Canada's Department of National Defence for 11 years before becoming a professor. I was involved in a whole bunch of war games and simulations. We all knew. Trump says it's a surprise. That makes no sense. We all knew that if there was a war for Iran's existence, for the Islamic Republic's very survival, it would use as a last resort the threat of attacking the Strait of Hormuz. We knew it in theory. Everybody in the Pentagon and the CIA knew it. Trump just didn't listen. Now we actually know it in practice. And that fundamentally changes things because Iran can just leave that threat out there subtly, indirectly, and sometimes not so subtly and quite directly. That will serve as the core mechanism of Iranian deterrence. Iran has attacked Gulf states. It can do so again. That will serve as a useful, secondary, but useful means of deterrence. And after that, the Bab al-Mandab in cooperation with the Houthis, that is now what the core of Iranian deterrence represents. What is the nature of this new equilibrium, this new balance of terror? To come back to the term that I used in my introductory remarks, I think in the big picture, we're starting to see it take shape, but the details are really not clear yet because it's still too early. The dust hasn't settled. So I think in the coming days and weeks, and realistically months and years, because this is not going to be over soon, we need to better understand what exactly is the nature of this new equilibrium. What does it mean? What are the risks? What are the threats? But also, what are the opportunities?
I mean, in a sense, in what you're saying, it gives me a little bit of maybe hope for closure. If 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 what you're saying is that things are somewhat anchored in Hormuz, rather than the proxies, we are seeing uh, Hezbollah pretty much engaged right now, and just, with Israel, the Houthis are quite cut off from the supply chains that are coming from Bandar Abbas. Their fuel imports are down 81%. They can't even import wire copper in the country to manufacture weapons. And half of their cabinet was degraded and taken out by Israel last year. We've seen them very shy, and the Houthis are not shy in entering the fight. So there's some kind of a blockade on the Houthis in terms of their supply. If things are concentrated around Hormuz, does that make escalation more controllable? So again, like looking at the blockade that Trump has imposed, do you think if he manages to outlast? Because also the question is, Iran won't be able to sell its oil. Um, and yes, there's much more, I mean, I can see smuggling routes on land, and maybe that's going to be the future trajectory. But Hormuz, if we block it that way, is that something that can let the regime capitulate? And after all, Houthis did capitulate in the Red Sea.
Let me just add one point to what I said before. The axis of resistance, Iran's ties to Hezbollah, Hamas, it still matters. It is still part of the equation. I think it's been downgraded in terms of its importance to Iran's deterrence strategy. Now, Hormuz is at the top of the list. So is, in its own special way, Bab el-Mandab. So are strikes against Gulf states. I think in that list of importance of Iranian tools of deterrence, the axis of resistance, besides the Houthis, has diminished in importance, but it's still there. I don't want to give the impression that it's gone, because it's not. And the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah until last week shows that even if, as a strategic threat, Hezbollah has been downgraded significantly, it absolutely is still there. Second point of nuance I would bring is that if there's one thing that we've learned from Iran over the decades, is its ability to evade sanctions and pressure and containment. It has an extraordinarily sophisticated state apparatus involving obviously the IRGC, but not just the IRGC, that allows it to smuggle weapons to the Houthis, that allows it to smuggle cash and other stuff to Hamas, right? I mean, Hamas has been extremely blockaded by Israel, embargoed, and so on, within the very small Gaza Strip for decades, and Iran was still able to smuggle in weapons, right? That tells us that Iran is, to be technical, very good at that. So how much will the US keep up either a blockade or, if not a blockade, enhanced containment of Iran beyond the short term? I suspect that that's a good possibility. I also strongly suspect that Iran is already thinking actively about how to evade that and how to procure what it needs to replenish its stocks of missiles and drones and other aspects that are essential to what the regime perceives as essential to its survival. So I think there will be the typical cat and mouse game that we've seen. That's a bit of not a very serious way to frame it, but I think you get what I mean, of U.S. measures and Iranian countermeasures to evade them. That will simply continue and intensify.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Thomas. That's again comprehensive as usual. So we have about a couple of minutes left. So I want to invite you and Sarah to just give us closing remarks, and maybe if you around maybe the question of how should we be watching most closely in the next coming months? What should be anticipating or watching more closely? I'll start with you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for organizing this. I really enjoyed the conversation. So, what really strikes me most about this episode is that, as Thomas mentioned, they've been talking about it, and that's what I meant, take them as face value. When they talk about closing Strait of Hormuz, believe them that they are going to, close the Strait of Hormuz, even if it means shooting themselves in their feet, which has actually translated to that. We the Western capitals have been fighting Iran in an asymmetric war. And now that Iran itself is fighting an asymmetric war, everybody is shocked and suddenly surprised. Oh, how do we deal with asymmetric war? I mean, Islamic Republic is the creator, the designer of all of these gains. And the Western capitals thought they can outplay that game. So for those reasons, and again going back to my obsession about the concept of resistance and what it means for the state apparatus inside Iran, what should it be? IRGC, the diplomats, the economic network of bypassing sanctions across the world. I'm sure you have, and your audience have seen at least a few reports in recent years about front companies, individuals, dual citizens have been suddenly become exposed in having played a great role in assisting the state. So long as Iran has that network, and so long as we manage in Western capitals to completely miss the key message that is being disseminated out of Tehran, I expect continuation of this crisis. I expect this becoming another one of those frozen conflicts that every now and again flares up. Few sites are bombed, a few threats are made here and there, and then we just get bored because domestically in democratic world we have constituencies. We need to be responsible. We need to give answers to the people that elect us into the office. And that is another one of those key points that we miss about the Iranian establishment. They don't have accountability. They don't have to be responsible to anybody. They don't need to deliver. They don't need to give answer to anybody. It doesn't, the Iranian people and their dissatisfaction is irrelevant to this equation. And we banked on that. And we sort of assume that because there is so much boiling dissatisfaction and there is so much boiling anger across the society, then this is the moment to bring Islamic Republic down. So unfortunately, I remain extremely depressed about the future of Iran and the region, and I remain extremely negative about the future of this conflict.
On that positive note, I'll go to Thomas. I completely understand, but yes, Thomas.
I wish I could be the one finishing on a more optimistic note, but I simply could not. I think we understand that that's the reality. I'll finish on a somewhat more specific point, but I think one that is of interest to me now in my own research, and I think one that matters that we don't talk enough about. I'm writing a book with a colleague now on transnational repression, right? Which is how governments repress not their own citizens within their own borders, but how they go internationally to repress, target dissidents, human rights activists in other countries. In Canada, we have significant Iranian Canadian, Chinese Canadian, Indian Canadian diaspora communities. We are a very, very diverse country, very open to immigration. And one of to my mind, in general, that's a very good thing. But one of the risks that comes with that is significant openings for transnational repression. I'll put aside the Indian and Chinese cases because it's not our focus today. But our Iranian Canadian community, which is close to 1% of the overall population of the country, so about 300 and something thousand people, are, as you can imagine, significant victims in many cases of transnational repression by the Islamic Republic. So being targeted for their human rights activism, their democratic activism against the Islamic Republic. So the Islamic Republic comes here in Canada physically through agents, through proxies, sometimes through links to organized crime, but also online where there is significant intimidation, defamation, threats, insults, and so on, disinformation. And also, obviously, inside Iran, where families of Canada-based human rights activists will be targeted and pressured. So that's the topic of the book I'm writing with the co-author now, focused on the Canadian case. Absolute horror stories, as you can imagine. My point that I want to mention here, to come back to Fatima's question about underestimated risks, transnational repression by the Islamic Republic of Iran in 2026 will intensify. And by intensify, I mean that it's already high. It's been going on for years, for decades, for that matter. But there is a clear pattern that intuitively, I think most of us would agree with, but my research clearly shows it. When there is an enhanced perception of vulnerability by the regime in combination with increased diaspora mobilization, the result is increased transnational repression. We saw that at the time of Women Life Freedom in 22 and 23, when the regime felt under pressure and diaspora communities, including, but not only here in Canada, were mobilizing more, the transnational repression really skyrocketed. I'm already speaking to Iranian Canadians in the past 2 or 3 weeks who are seeing. At this point, it's anecdotal. It's hard, obviously, as you can imagine, to really see clear patterns, but anecdotally, I am absolutely seeing intensifying transnational repression by Iran here in Canada. And my assumption, which I cannot prove to you right now, but I'm convinced that it is valid, is that if I see it in Canada, it is going on in the US, it is going on in European countries, it is also going on in Gulf countries, right? We forget about them, even if they're not democracies, but transnational repression happens there as well. So bottom line, and I'll finish here, underestimated risk in 2026, enhanced efforts by the Islamic Republic to target dissidents abroad.
Thank you, Thomas. That's a very important topic, and I'm really glad that you're shedding light on it. Thank you both, Sarah and Thomas, and thank you to our audience. This was a very valuable discussion, and thanks everyone for joining us.